So what you're looking at is the totalitarianism and fascism assignment, and I'll show you an example of what it should end up looking like and how to set it up here in just a second. But this first part, you're going to define for us what totalitarianism is, and we're going to focus on totalitarianism first, and you're going to create for us a definition of that in groups of 3, and you're going to then create what we'll call a checkoff list of 5 of the major characteristics that define totalitarianism. To do that, you're going to work in groups of 3, and each one of you is going to pull a separate resource, a different website or a different resource that explains totalitarianism and the characteristics of it, and you're going to cross-check with one another those different characteristics. And if all 3 of you in your different resources have the same characteristic, then that's a characteristic that can go into your checkoff list. So let me show you an example of what that looks like. And here's an example checkoff list. So you're going to set up your Google Doc this way. Make sure all 3 of your team members' names are up here in the header, top right. You're going to give me a title, totalitarianism checklist. You're going to give me a description or a definition of it. Make sure it's 2 to 3 sentences, something like that, to really kind of define what it is. And then you're going to list the 5 different characteristics here and a brief description of what that characteristic is. So don't call it totalitarian characteristic number 1. Tell me what that characteristic actually is. And so you're going to do that and kind of set it up this way. Leave yourself some spaces in here. Notice I'm using the checkbox feature to make it look like I can check those boxes as I go to use this thing later to compare. Then, once you have your checklist created between your group, then you guys are going to work on part 2, where you're actually going to look up some historical examples of totalitarian governments or regimes from the past. You're going to focus on let me get this out of here. You're going to focus on the World War I to World War II era, so between 1915 to 1945, something like that. And you're going to find 2 different examples of totalitarianism. Then you're going to read about those different totalitarian governments or regions, and you're going to then compare them to your checklist and figure out if that regime fits within each one of these different characteristics. And so you need to provide examples to determine whether or not they did. So if you say, yes, it did, and then you need to provide, well, look, they had these laws or they had this particular policy, and that is an example of this, and you explain the policy and that kind of thing. But you're going to type in your information here. And so to create that, you want to use this as your template, which means you're going to have to create a brand new Google Doc as a copy of this, so that way then you can start to populate it with your information and your answers for each one of those regimes. So don't use the original one, make a copy of it, and submit the copy for each one of those different parts. Okay? And so you're going to have 2 examples of historical totalitarianism regimes. Then you're going to look up a modern day example and see if there's anything going on in the world today that relates. And then do the same analysis using your checklist and make sure to use, once again, a new Google Doc. And then you're going to create a checklist for fascism and figure out what fascism is and what the major characteristics of that are. Based on that, you're going to then look up 2 historical examples of fascist leaders, Hitler and Stalin, compare them to your checkoff list for fascism, and find out if they truly are fascist leaders or they just kind of seem like fascist leaders based on your characteristics. And then finally, you're going to answer the question, fascism in America, can fascism occur here in America? And you need to provide 2 or 3 different examples as to why it can or why it cannot. Okay? But once again, I want you to make sure that each time you're going to do your research, you use this as a template and you create a copy of it, so that way you then can fill in the information here and you don't have to mess with the original template that you created.